Blue Book, pages 126 to 134. That's a long one. The landlord in the East from the 16th century onward was solidly entrenched in his own domain. Monarch of all he surveyed, with no troublesome barigis to annoy him, for towns are few, and with kings and territorial rulers soliloquious of his wishes. Travelers from the west were impressed with the lavishness of great Polish and Lithuanian magazinets, with their pastoral homes, private art galleries, well-stocked libraries, collections of jewels, swarms of servants, trains of dependent lesser gentry, gargantuan diners, and barbaric hospitality. The Junkers of northeast Germany lived more modestly but enjoyed the same kind of independence and social superiority. The importance of all this will become evident when in later chapters we turn to Prussia, Poland, Russia, and the Austrian lands. But meanwhile, with all the economic growth and social development that has been sketched at in the preceding pages, Europe was torn by the destructive ferocity of the wars of religion. The Crusade of Catholic Spain, the Dutch and English. The ambitions of Philip II. Charles V, having tried in vain for 35 years to preserve the religious unity in Germany, abdicated in his many crowns and retired to a monastery in 1556, the year after the Peace of Augsburg. He left Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, or the small part of it which is not occupied by the Turks, to his brother Ferdinand, who was soon elected to the Holy Roman Empire. All his other possessions Charles left to his son Philip, who became Philip II of Spain. The Habsburg dynasty remained thereafter divided into two branches, the Austrian and the Spanish. The two cooperated in European affairs. The Spanish branch for a century was the more important. Philip II not only possessed the Spanish kingdoms, but in 1580 inherited Portugal, so that the whole Iberian Peninsula was brought under his rule. He possessed the 17 provinces in the Netherlands and the Free County of Burgundy, which were the member states of the Holy Roman Empire. Lying on its western border, adjacent to France, Milan in the north, Italy and Naples in the south, belonged to Philip, and since he had also held the chief islands as well as Tunis, he enjoyed a naval ascendancy in the western Mediterranean, which was threatened only by the Turks. For 5 years until 1558, he was titular King of England, titular King of England, and in 1589, in the name of his daughter, he laid claim to the throne of France. All America belonged to Philip II, and after 1580, all the Portuguese Empire as well, so that, except for a few nautical daredevils, all ships plying the open ocean were the Spanish kings. Philip II therefore naturally regarded himself as an international figure, and the more so he thought in terms of but he thought of in terms of not of nationality, but of religion. Before all else he was Catholic, fervid and fanatical, committed to upholding the sway of the universal church, within which all nations were no more than minorities, and all heretics were no more than rebels. A grave and sober man, this, of abstemious personal habits, sharing the moral severity of the Catholic reform, and in the dark, brooding, and tormented inner world of the Spanish mystics, he took upon himself the headship of the far-flung Catholic counter-offensive, into which he was willing to pour with grim persistence the blood and the treasure of all his kingdoms. To economic and material interests he gave no thought, and in such matters the Spanish society began to deteriorate in his reign. But for all material problems, the wealth of Potosi provided a facile solution, and meanwhile Spain entered upon the golden age of its culture. In this period, the Siglo de Oro, running in round dates from 1550 to 1650, Cervantes wrote his Don Quixote, and López de Vera his 700 dramas, while El Greco, Murillo, and Vasquez painted their pictures, and the Jesuit Suarez composed works on the philosophy and law that were read in even Protestant countries. But the essence of Spanish life was in its particularly intensive Catholicism. The Church was vitally present in every social level, from the Archbishop of Totelo, who ranked above the grandees and could address the king as an equal, down to the host of penniless and murderant friars. who were mixed with the poorest and most disinherited of the people. It is said that when about 1,600 of a third of the population of Spain was in one way or another in service of the church. Spain, whose whole history had been a crusade, was ideally suited to be Philip's instrument in the re-Catholicizing of Europe. Philip II built himself a new royal residence. Palace is hardly the word. The Escorial, which he expressed in solid stone, its creator's inner spirit. Madrid itself was a new town, merely a government center, far from the worldly distractions of Toledo or Valladolid. But it was 30 miles from Madrid, on the bleak, arid plateau of the central Castile, overlooked by the jagged Sierra, that Philip chose to erect the Escorial. He built in honor of St. Lawrence, whose feast day he had won in the battle against the French. A great pile of connecting buildings was laid out in the shape of a grill, since, according to Martyrologists, St. Lawrence in the year 258 had been roasted alive on a grill over burning coals. Somber and vast, angular and relived, made of blocks of granite meant to last forever, and with the highest spire rising 300 feet from the ground. The Escorial was designed not only as a palace but also as a monastery and a malagazam. The monks moved in before the king, who, when he installed himself, brought with him 8 coffins, those of his father, his dead wives, and his children, to remind him of his own. Here, in an atmosphere that could be painted only by El Greco, the King of Spain worked and lived, a slim figure dressed almost like a monk himself, always industrious, avid for detail, dispatching his courtiers to Mexico, to Melina, to Vienna, and to Milan, his troops and his bars of Boulogne to Italy and the Netherlands, his diplomats to all courts, his spies to all countries, wholly and utterly absorbed in his one consuming project. Let us try to see the events of time internationally, for although it may be confusing to try to see all nations together, it is distorting to look at only one of them alone. The first years of Philip's reign were the first years of Elizabeth's reign in England, where the religious issue there was still in flux. They were years in which Calvinism agitated the Netherlands, and when France, ruled by teenage boys, fell apart into implacable civil war. Religious loyalties that knew no frontiers overlapped all political boundaries. Everywhere there were people who looked for guidance outside their own countries. Calvinists in England, France, and the Netherlands felt closer to one another than to their own monarchs or their own neighbors. Zealous Catholics in all 3 countries welcomed the support of the international Catholic forces, the Jesuits of the King of Spain, the Pope. National unity threatened to dissolve, or was not yet formed. The sense of mutual trust between people who lived side by side was eaten away, and people who lived not only in the same country, but in the same town, on the same street, or even in the same house, turned against each other in the name of a higher cause. For about 5 years, beginning in 1567, it seemed that the Catholic cause might prevail. The Great Crusade took the offensive in all fronts. In 1567, Philip sent new and firmer governor-general to the Netherlands, the Duke of Alva. With 20,000 Spanish soldiers, the Duke proceeded to suppress religious and political dissidents by establishing a Council of Troubles. In 1569, Philip put down a revolt of the Moriscos in Spain, in the same year that the Catholics of northern England, led by the Dutch of Norfolk, and sewing the cross of crusaders on their own garments, rose in armed rebellion against the Herrick Queen. In the next year, 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth and absolved her subjects from allegiance to her, so that English Catholics, if they wished, could henceforth in good conscience conspire to overthrow her. In 1571, the Spanish won a great naval battle against the Turks. At Lepano, off the coast of Greece, on their sails they wove the same cross that had been raised on the other corner of Europe by the Duke of Norfolk in England, and they themselves believed that they were carrying on the Crusades in the Middle Ages. In the next year, 1572, the Catholic leaders of France, with the advice of the Pope and of Philip II, decided to make an end of the Huguenots, or the French Protestants. Over 3,000 were seized and put to death on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day in Paris alone, and this massacre was followed by lesser liquidations throughout the provinces. But none of these victories proved enduring. The Turkish power was not seriously damaged at Lepanto. In fact, the Turks took Tunis from Philip 2 years later. The Moriscos were not assimilated. The English Catholic rebellion was stamped out. 800 persons were put to death by Elizabeth's government. The revolt in the Netherlands remained very much alive, as did the French Huguenots. 20 years later, England was Protestant. The Dutch were winning independence, a Huguenot had become the King of France, and the Spanish fleet had gone to ruin in northern waters. Let us see how these events came to pass. The Revolt of the Netherlands. The Netherlands, or Low Countries that they had no other name, roughly comprised the area of modern kingdoms of the Netherlands and Belgium, and in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. They consisted of 17 provinces, in which the 15th century, one by one, had been inherited, purchased, or conquered by the Dukes of Burgundy, from whom they were inherited by Charles V and his son Philip II. In the mid-16th century, neither a Dutch nor a Belgian nationality yet existed. In the northern provinces, the people spoke German dialects. In the southern provinces, they spoke dialects of French. But neither here nor elsewhere in Europe it was felt that the language boundaries had anything to do with political borders. The southern provinces had for centuries been busy commercial centers, and we have now seen that Antwerp, having once flourished on trade with Venice, now flourished with trade on Lisbon. The northern provinces, or rather 2 of them, which were most open at the sea, the counties of Holland and Zeeland, had developed rapidly in the 15th century. They had a popular literature on their own, written in their own kind of German, which came to be called Dutch. The lay piety of the Brothers of the Common Life had originated in this region, and here Erasmus of Rotterdam had been born. The wealth of the northern provinces was drawn from deep-sea fishing. Amsterdam was said to be built on herring bones, and the Dutch, when they were added trading to fishing, still lived by sea. The northern provinces felt no tie with each other, and no sense of difference from the south. Each of the 17 provinces was a small state or a country in itself. Each province enjoyed a typical medieval liberties, privileges, and immunities, including the right to preserve its own law and consent in its name to taxes. This constitution of the Netherlands, for such it was, went under the name of Joyous Entry. From the Joyous Entry, made by the reigning Duke into Brussels in 1355, after a solemn promise to recognize the liberties of the province of Brabant. The common bond of all 17 provinces was simply beginning with the Dukes of Burgundy. They had the same ruler, but since they had an Estates General, and so developed an embryonic sense of federal collaboration. The feeling of the Netherlandish identity was heightened with the accession of Philip II, for Philip, unlike his father, was thought of as foreign, a Spaniard who lived in Spain, and after 1560, Spanish governors general, Spanish officials, and Spanish troops were seen more frequently in the Netherlands. Moreover, since the Netherlands were the crossroads of Europe, with a tradition of earnestness in religion, Protestant ideas took root very early, and after 1560, when religious wars began in France, and a great many French Calvinists fled across the borders, at first there were probably more Calvinists in southern provinces than in northern, among the people that we now call Belgians, than among those then we call Dutch. The revolt against Philip II was inextricably political and religious at the same time, and it became increasingly an economic struggle as the years went by. It began in 1566, when some 200 nobles of the various provinces found a league to check the foreign or Spanish influence in the Netherlands. The league, to which both the Catholics and the Protestant nobles belonged, petitioned Philip II not to employ the Spanish Inquisition in the Netherlands. They feared that the trouble it would stir up. They feared it as a foreign court. They feared that enforcement of its rulings, the liberties of the provinces, would be crushed. Philip's agents in the Netherlands refused the petition. A mass revolt now broke out. Within a week, fanatical Calvinists pillaged 400 churches, pulling down images, breaking stained glass windows, defacing paintings and tapestries, making off with gold chalices, destroying with fierce contempt of the symbols of popery and idolatry. The fury spread from town to town, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to Amaricis, now in France, but then in the Netherlands. It was chiefly journeymen wage earners, numerous in the industrial Netherlands. Aroused by the social and economic grievances, as well as religious belief, who formed the rank and file for these anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish demonstrators. Before such vandalism, many of the petitioning nobles recoiled. The Catholic among them, as well as the less militant Protestants, unable to control their revolutionary followers, began to look upon the Spanish authorities with less disfavor. Philip II, appalled at the sacrilege, forth was sent in the Inquisition, the Duke of Alva, the reinforcements of the Spanish troops. Alva's Council of Troubles, nicknamed the Council of Blood, sentenced some thousands to death, levied new taxes, and confiscated the estates of a number of important nobles. These measures united people of all classes in opposition. What might have been primarily a class conflict on the character of national opposition, at its head emerged one of the noblemen whose estates had been confiscated, William of Orange, or called William the Silent. Philip II, standholder, lieutenant in the county of Holland. Beginning to claim the authority of a sovereign, he issued the letters of marque, or authorizations to ship captains, Dutch, Danes, Scots, English, to make war at sea. Fishing crews, sea dogs, and downright pirates began to raid small port towns of the Netherlands and France, descending upon them without warning, desecrating the churches, looting, torturing, and killing, in a wild recombination of religious rage, political hatred, and lust for booty. The Spanish reciprocated by renewing their confiscations, their inquisitorial tortures, and their burnings and hangings. The Netherlands was torn by anarchy, revolution, and civil war. No lines were clear, either political or religious. But in 1576, the anti-Spanish feeling prevailed over religious difference. Representatives of all 17 provinces put aside the religious question, formed a union to drive out Spanish at any cost. The involvement of England. But the Netherlands Revolution, though a national revolution with political independence as its first aim, was only part of the international politico-religious struggle. All sorts of other interests became involved in it. Queen Elizabeth of England sent aid to the Netherlands, though it lasted for many years surreptitiously, not wishing to provoke a war with Spain, in which was fear that English Catholics might want to side with the Spaniards. Elizabeth was troubled by having on her hands an unwanted guest, Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic who had been the Queen of France until her husband's premature death, and Queen of Scotland until driven out by errant Calvinist lords, and who, if the Pope, the King of Spain, the Society of Jesus, and the many English Catholics were to have their way, would also be Queen of England, instead of the upstart Elizabeth. Elizabeth, under these circumstances, kept Mary Stuart imprisoned. Many intrigues were afoot to put Mary on the English throne, some with and some without Mary's knowledge. In 1576, Don Juan, hero of Lepano and a half-brother of Philip II, became Governor-General of the embattled Netherlands. It was his grandiose idea, formed after the consultations in Rome, not merely to subdue the Netherlands, but to use that country as a base for invasion of England, and to overthrow Elizabeth with Spanish troops, to put Mary Stuart on the throne, marry her himself, and so become the king of re-Catholicized England. Thus the security of Elizabeth in Protestant England was coming to depend on the outcome of fighting in the Netherlands. Elizabeth signed an alliance with the Netherland patriots. Don Juan died in 1578 and was succeeded as Governor-General of the Netherlands by the Prince of Parma. A diplomat a diplomat as well as a soldier, Parma broke the solid front of the 17 provinces as the mixture of force and persuasion. He promised that the historic liberties of the Joyce entry would be respected, and he appealed not only to the more zealous Catholics, but to moderates who were wary of the struggle and repelled by the mob violence and religious vandalism. On this basis, he rallied the southernmost provinces to his side. The 7 northern provinces, led by Holland and Zeeland, responded by forming the Union of Utrecht in 1579. In 1581, they formally declared their independence from the King of Spain, calling themselves the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Thus originated what became more commonly called the Dutch Republic, or simply Holland, in the views of the predominance that the country belonged to the 7. The great Flemish towns of Antwerp, Ghent, and Bruges at first sided with the Union. Where formerly all had been turmoil, a geographical line was now drawn. The South, rallying to Philip II, now faced still a rebellious North, but neither side accepted such partition. Parma still fought to reconquer the North, and the Dutch, led by William the Silent, still struggled to clear the Spanish out of 17 provinces. Meanwhile, the two sides fought to capture the intermediate Flemish cities. When Parma moved upon Antwerp, still the leading port of North Sea, and one from which an invasion of England could be mounted, Elizabeth at last openly entered the war on the side of the rebels, sending 6,000 English troops into the Netherlands under the Earl of Leicester. In 1585, England was now clearly emerging as the chief bulwark of Protestantism and of the anti-Spanish feeling in northwestern Europe. In England itself, a popular fears of Spain, the popular resistance against Catholic plots revolving around Mary Stuart, and the popular indignation at foreign and outside meddling in English matters produced an unprecedented sense of national solidarity. The country rallied to Protestantism and to Elizabeth, and even her Catholic minority for the most part disowned the conspiracies against her. The English were now openly and defiantly allied with the Protestant Dutch. Not only were they fighting together in the Netherlands, but both English and Dutch sea raiders fell upon Spanish shipping, captured treasure ships, and even pillaged the Spanish Main, the mainland coast of northern South America. The Dutch were beginning to penetrate East Indian waters. Elizabeth was negotiating with Scotland, with German Calvinists and French Huguenots. At the Eschatorial, it was said that the Netherlands could only be re-won by an invasion of England, that the Queen of the heretics must be at last dethroned, and that in any case it was cheaper to launch a gigantic attack upon England than to pay the cost of protecting Spanish galleons. Year after year, against the depravations of the piratical sea dogs, Philip II therefore prepared to invade England. The English retorted with vigor. Mary Stuart, after almost 20 years' imprisonment, was executed in 1587 in a roused Parliament. More than Elizabeth herself demanded her life on the eve of foreign attack. Sir Francis Drake, most spectacular of the sea dogs, sailed into the port of Cadiz and burnt the very ships assembling there to join the Armada. This was jocosely described as the singing beard of the King of Spain, singeing the beard of the King of Spain. The Great Armada, the Armada Cattolica, was ready early in 1588. With crosses on the sails and banners bearing the image of the Holy Virgin, it went forth a new Lepano against the Turks of the north. It consisted of 130 ships, weighing 58,000 tons, carrying 30,000 men, and 2,400 pieces of artillery. The most prodigious assemblage of naval power that the world had ever seen. In Spain, only the pessimistic observed that its commander was no seaman, that in some of the ships were too cumbersome and too frail to the weather of the gales of the north, and that orders had to be issued to its crews in 6 languages, and the antagonisms of the Portuguese, Catalans, Castilians, Irishmen, and the Imerigi English Catholics somehow appeased. The plan was for the fleet to sail to the Netherlands from which it was to escort the Prince of Parma's army across the straits to the English coast. In the Channel, the Armada was met by some 200 English vessels, with Sir Francis Drake as a vice-admiral under Lord Howard of Effingham. The English craft, lighter, smaller, and faster, though well furnished with guns, harried the lumbering masses of the Armada, broke up its formations, attacked its great vessels one by one. It found no refuge at Culloss, where English fireships drove it out again to sea. Then arose a storm, the famous Protestant wind, which blew the Armada northward into the seas and southerns of almost polar, around the tips of Scotland, the Orkney Keys, the Hebrides, and Northern Ireland, forbidding the coasts which the Spaniards had to skirt around without charts or pilots, for which they strewed with their wreckage and their bones. The results of the struggle. The war went on for several years. Philip died in 1598, after a long and horrible illness, a frustrated and a broken man. In the wars with Spain and the English had, above all else, assured their national independence. They had acquired an intense national spirit, a love of this other Eden, demi-paradise, this precious stone set in silver sea, as Shakespeare wrote, and they had become more solidly Protestant, almost anonymously set against popery, unanimously set against popery. With the ruin of the Armada, they were more free to take to the sea. We have now seen how the English East India Company was founded in 1600. In the Netherlands, the battle lines swayed back and forth until 1609. In that year, a 12-year truce was agreed to. By this truce, the Netherlands were partitioned. The line of partition ran somewhat farther along north than it had in Parma's time, for the Spaniards had retaken the Antwerp and other cities in the middle zone. The 7 provinces of the North Line, those had formed the Union of Utrecht in 1579, were henceforth known as the Dutch. The 10 provinces south of the line were known as the Spanish Netherlands. Protestants in the south either became Catholics or fled to the north, so that the south, the modern Belgium, became solidly Catholic, while the number of Protestants in the north was increased. Even so, the Dutch was not completely Protestant people, for probably as many as a third of them remained Catholic. Calvinism was the religion of most Dutch burghers, and the religion favored by the state, but in the face of an exceptionally large religious minority, the Dutch Netherlands adopted a policy of toleration. The southern Netherlands were ruined by almost 40 years of war. The Dutch, moreover, occupied the mouth of the Scheldeberg and refused to allow ocean-going vessels to proceed upstream to Antwerp or to Ghent. The Scheldeberg remained closed for 2 centuries, and the Flemish cities never recovered their old positions. Amsterdam became the commercial and financial center of northern Europe. It retained its commercial supremacy for a century and its financial supremacy for over 2 centuries. For the Dutch, as well as for the English, the weakening of Spanish naval power opened the way to the sea. The Dutch East India Company was organized in 1602. Both Dutch and the English began to found overseas colonies. The English settled in Virginia in 1607, the Dutch at New York in 1612. As for Spain, while it remained the most formidable military power of Europe for another half-century, its internal decline had already begun. At the death of Philip II, the monarchy was living from hand to mouth, habitually depending on the next arrival of treasure from the Indies. The productive force of the country were weakened by inflation, by taxation, by immigration, by depopulation. At Seville, for example, only 400 looms were in operation in 1621, where there had been 16,000 a century earlier. Spain suffered from the very circumstances that made it great. The qualities most useful in leading the Counter-Reformation were not those on which a modern society could be easily built. The generations of crusading against infidels, heathens, and heretics had produced an exceptionally large number of minor aristocrats, chevaliers, dons, and hidalgos, who as a class were contemptuous of work, who were numerous enough and close enough to the common people to impress their haughty indifference upon the country as a whole. With the extreme concentration of religion, the ablest men entered the church, and so great was the popular admiration for the saints and mystics, the missionaries and crusaders, theologians, archbishops, ascetics, and begging friars, that more secular activities offered little psychological satisfaction or reward. The very unity accomplished under Ferdinand and Isabella threatened to dissolve. After more than a century of the Inquisition, people were still afraid of the false Christians and crypto-Muslims. The question of the Moriscos rose again in 1608. The Moriscos included some of the best farmers and the most skilled artisans in the country. They lived in almost all parts of Spain and were in no sense a foreign element, since they were simply the descendants of those Spaniards who, in Muslim period, had begun 900 years before, had adopted the Muslim religion and Arabic language and culture. They are now supposedly Christian, but the true and pure Christians accuse them of preserving in secret the rites of Islam and out of sympathy for the Barbary pirates. They were thought to be clannish, marrying among themselves, and they were so efficient, sober, and hard-working that they outdistanced other Spaniards in competition. In 1609, some 150,000 Moriscos were driven out of Valencia. In 1610, some 64,000 were driven from Aragon. In 1611, an unknown number were expelled from Castile. All were simply put on boats and sent off with what they could carry. Spain, whose total population was rapidly falling in many cases, thus lost one of the most socially valuable, if not religious orthodox, of all its minorities. Nor could the Christian kingdoms hold peaceably together. In 1640, Portugal, which had been rejoined to the Spanish crown since 1580, when its own ruling line had run out, re-established its independence. That same year, Catalonia rose in its open rebellion. The Catalan War, in which the French streamed across the Pyrenees to aid the rebels, lasted for almost 20 years. Catalonia was at last reconquered, but it managed to preserve its own privileges and separate identity. Catalan and Castilian viewed as each other with increased repugnance. The Spanish kingdoms are almost as disunited in spirit and in institutions as in the days of Isabella and Ferdinand. They suffered, too, during the 17th century from the line of kings whose mental peculiarities reached the point of positive impeccability. Meanwhile, however, the might of Spain was still to be felt in both Germany and in France. End of page 134.